Nope, still water. Oh, well. So today's sermon will likely go, by the way, as long as my voice holds out. Unless it's really good, in which case we could be here a while. But so here we are with this wonderful story of Jesus going to a wedding in Cana. And it's quite a well-known story. It's quite a popular story to hear because it's such an interesting story. It kind of, on the one hand, is it's almost like Jesus does a magic trick kind of a story. And on the other hand, it's who is this guy anyway kind of a story. I've always wanted, I always chicken out, but I've always wanted, when this scripture passage comes up, I've always wanted to show, there's a very funny sketch that Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, Rowan Atkinson does where he's dressed as a vicar, reading the scripture from the lectern in some big Anglican church, and he starts off with this passage. There's a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and when it gets to the part where the water is turned into wine, and the steward knew not whence it had come, he goes, but the people in the kitchen did know, and they applauded loudly. And then it kind of goes from there into this bit about how Jesus does all these tricks. Because you know what? Changing water into wine isn't a miracle. It's a trick. Even in the first century, magicians could do that trick. Anybody could turn water into wine. It's like doing that thing with the pea that's under the cups and you move it around. A little card trick maybe as well. It's a trick. And yet, right out of the gate, John's first story about Jesus is he does a trick. Really? What's the point of that? It's not like he, calmed the storm or walked across the water. That's coming up later, actually. But it's a sleight of... Lori and I went to The Illusionists just recently. Did anybody go to The Illusionists? Yeah, it's a show. It's five guys that do. They're quite happy to say to you, they're not magicians. They're illusionists, because it isn't magic. It's an illusion. It's sleight of hand, or it's some sort of way of getting you to look over here while they do this over there and do. It's not magic. It's an illusion. It's an incredible skill, and by the way, they're awesome. And if you ever get the chance to see the show, it's really quite amazing. But it's quite an amazing thing. And even knowing that there's an explanation for it, in your head you're kind of going, "Wow, that's I don't know how he did that." But obviously there's a way you do that, but I don't know what it is. But it's really cool. That's what changing water into wine is kind of like. It's one of those. It's not a big deal. In the first century, there were other people who could do that trick. So why is it a big deal here? Well, traditionally, we see, in fact, this is one of the simplest epiphany stories, because the reason why it's an epiphany story is actually in the story. It's at the very end where it says, Jesus revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. Thing is, according to the story, only the people who filled the water pots knew that Jesus had done it. So to me, I think the real miracle here, the real mystery, if you like, is how did they know Jesus did it? He didn't do it in front of everybody. No one knew that he'd done it. His mother probably guessed because she told him to do something, and almost like a teenager, he said no. But it's in the story. It says only the people who were working, who knew that they'd filled the pots with water, knew that Jesus had anything to do with it. And yet the disciples believed. That's some trick. But the story isn't just about Jesus being revealed as somebody who can do stuff. you might also want to consider, by the way, it's not just a question of doing the trick. There might be an issue of why. In the first century, weddings, by the way, lasted a week. And there were things that happened each day. And it was like just a big party for a week. So to run out of wine at a wedding was not just a social faux pas. The whole town knew that you'd screwed that up. It was bad. It was bad. So Jesus saved the hosts of the party, basically. That was an interesting way of phrasing that, wasn't it? Jesus saved them. Anyway, he saved them. But there's a little bit more to it. Let's think about the story less about what's revealed in the actual thing that happened and more metaphorically. Sometimes in our lives we feel like the wine has run out. Where do we go? What do we do? Perhaps Jesus is the replenishment of that. And maybe that's part of what the story is about. It's that when we feel that way in our lives, Jesus refreshes us, renews us. And not just with any old ordinary stuff. Right? The steward quite pointedly says, you've saved the best till last. Which, given they'd probably been drinking for 3 days straight, I don't know how he knew that, but it's not just that it's replenishment, it's that it's the best. But then you might want to think that one step further and think, metaphorically speaking, perhaps the water into wine story is about God's grace and love, which is not only freely given, but abundantly given. Those 6 large water pots, which would have been used for purification rites, by the way, would have been huge, like this big huge. So it's a lot, probably more than was needed. So God's grace is not only freely given, it's abundant, and what is it? It's the best, is what it is. It's the best. So maybe the story is also about how God's grace is given and love is given. And where does it come from? If you're anybody but the people who helped Jesus with the water pot thing, you don't really know. In other words, it wasn't asked for, it just appeared. It was given. So maybe it's about God's grace too. Maybe there's something else here worth thinking about. Each of the Gospels, each of the synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? The 3 that are the same, essentially, have the same story, narrative storyline. Each of them begins with Jesus being baptized by John in the Jordan. He goes into the desert, he has the desert experience, and then he goes off into ministry. He literally appears out of nowhere at the age of 30 to be baptized by John in the Jordan. And last week, I suggested that one of the most powerful things about that is that Jesus appears with everyone as one of us. In fact, in the first century, they went to great lengths to try and distance themselves from that part of the story because it sounded like it was giving John too much credit for what was going on there. And it also, making Jesus appear more like us, made Jesus appear less divine. So let's focus on the dove comes down in this as the form of the Spirit, and this is my beloved Son. That part of the story, right? John's gospel begins with Jesus basically just wandering around, and John sees Jesus and points him out to the disciples. So right before this story, John points Jesus out to his own disciples and says, that's the guy. And it even says that John sees the dove alight on Jesus, so he knows that's the guy. There's no baptism story. The first story that Jesus actually really participates in is he goes to a party and brings the wine. So even John's gospel, the first story of Jesus is about Jesus doing something just like you and me. It's a story of Jesus doing something that he would have done just because he was part of the community, part of the family. Everybody in town would have been invited to a wedding. It was a community event in those days. Whether you knew the family or not, really, everyone was invited. So again, here's a story. Jesus begins with us as one of us, doing what we do. It's so easy. It's so easy to go, Jesus, the Son of God, divine, and set him apart over here. And yet each of these gospels, each of these stories of the life of Jesus that we have begins with him doing something with us. John's gospel, remember too, is the one that begins, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was made, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's the very beginning of John's gospel. And there's a part in there too where it says, he was of the world, and yet the world knew him not. Do you remember that part? He was among us, but we didn't know. But those who did were the children of God. So here's Jesus coming to a wedding. He does this thing with the water and the wine that nobody really knows he did. He's just being like us. Just trying to help out. Didn't want the host to be embarrassed. Do you think, like I was saying to the kids, do you think Jesus was one of those people who sits in a corner, like at a wedding? I mean, you've probably been to a wedding party at some point, or some kind of a party. Would Jesus sit in the corner by himself? Did he work the room? I mentioned a couple of film versions of this story, and traditionally that's how we tell this story, by the way. Everybody's having a good party over here, and here's Jesus sitting over here looking solemn, appropriately solemn and holy. And Mary comes to him and says they're out of wine, and he very solemnly intones, "Woman, what does that mean to me?" And by the way, the thing is, we treat that like Jesus disdainfully going, "Woman." But in fact, a more accurate translation of that from the original text is something that's more like, something that's more affectionate, meaning simply acknowledging she's there. It's not meant to be disdainful at all. And in all reality, I mean, what does that have to do with Jesus? He's a guest at the party. Did Mary think he was going to do something? And if she did, how'd she know he was going to do something? That seems to be implied when Jesus says, "It's not my time yet." Words that often have a more cryptic meaning in the story of Jesus. So how do you see Jesus in this story? Do you see him being just like you or me, like participating in the, okay, I don't actually really dance, but I imagine Jesus did. I bet he did. I bet he was having a good time. I bet when Mary came to him and said they're out of wine, I bet he didn't just go, "Woman, what's that to me?" I bet he thought, "Oh, dang, this is going to be bad." Because here's the thing about the story. It emphasizes, in many ways, it emphasizes the divinity of Jesus. Sure, he does a really cool miracle thing, which we've already established many magicians could do in that day anyway, because it's a trick. But he does that, and as a result, the disciples believe. Okay, fine. Except what about the humanity of Jesus? Isn't, just like with the baptism story, isn't the humanity of Jesus revealed here too? He was doing what people do. He was participating in the community. He was being part of what everyone else was being part of. And probably just like anybody else, he didn't want to see the party end, and he didn't want to see the host be embarrassed. He wanted to do whatever he could do to help. There's a very, very human side to this story. The reason why I always think that's so important is because the more we consider the divinity of Jesus, and the more we make that our focus, the easier it is to put Jesus over there, or up there, but far away. The easier it is to make it clear that Jesus was different. And sure, okay. But see, I have a feeling that Jesus would respond to that by saying, so are you. The Spirit of God is alive in you as much as me. See, I think part of the whole point of John even saying the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Love, we sometimes, love came down, right? God became like us. What would be the point of that if not experiencing what it means to be like us, first of all? And secondly, isn't a big piece of that to remind us not of the distance between us and God, but the connectedness between us and God? God is in you. We are created in the image of God. Jesus never asks anything that Jesus isn't already willing to do. Jesus wants you to understand that it's not just a question of Jesus being like us. It's a question of you being like Jesus. That's the part that truly brings us closer to God. And we talk, I like to frame it this way anyway, but the whole point of the story of Jesus and the crucifixion part of the story of Jesus isn't about sacrifice, it's about bringing us closer to God. That's what that sacrifice does. It's not about atonement. It's about bringing us closer to God, about bringing us back to God. One of the ways that Jesus does that is by living, just like you and me. To remind us that we are connected to God. So I think looking at this story, I think it's sure, Jesus does a miracle, and because of that miracle, the disciples believe in him, and off we go into ministry. Sure. It's great. But not only does Jesus do this miracle story, he participates in the whole thing. He's also being very human, just like you and me. He's not just participating in the community by doing things for them, but by doing things with them. This is the Jesus that sits next to you where you're sitting right now. This is the Jesus that you meet on the street on a regular basis or in other places. This is the Jesus that we meet all the time because Jesus is here in you and me. Not set apart somewhere, but right here in you and me.